Welcome back to Season 4 of More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This week we're talking about portfolio careers and transitioning into new roles. We're welcoming a wonderful guest, Fiona Galbraith, a military veteran who has pivoted from a battalion commander to the founder of Ruralink, a specialist consultancy working with individuals, employers and education providers to improve pathways into land-based careers. So, come and join us for Being Able to Pivot.
Hi, and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. And we have a lovely guest this week, Fiona Galbraith, who is a veteran and also someone I have known for a very, very long time. So she's kindly agreed to come and talk to us really about the topic of pivoting, how we can change careers, how we can prepare for that, and also some of the elements of service in the military that make us particularly good at pivoting. So, Fiona, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Bridge. Hi, Bobby.
Hello.
Yeah, I think I'm really conscious that I've done quite a lot of things since I left the forces, and it's quite interesting to reflect why that is. Some of it's circumstance, but I think some of it is the value set that maybe I was brought up with, but that was enhanced by military service. And I think one of the things that's drummed into army officers is the Sandhurst motto of serve to lead and this idea of servant leader. And I think that's defined who I am, really. But one of my characteristics that's taken me through various things is an innate, well, is it innate? An outwardly obvious self-confidence. And I was reflecting on this, and I think what I am is someone who, well, I was bullied as a child, and I think the defensiveness is that it still comes out. So everything I do, I approach now with a sort of desire to be kind and to see kindness in other people. So I've done, I was an army officer 25 years. I did a little bit of reserve service. I've gone on to various roles. I've set up my own business, and that's pivoted a bit, which we might discuss. I now work as a university lecturer, and I run 2 courses, which we can discuss if that's of interest. And I'm chair of a sixth form college. I'm looking to expand my career into other non-executive roles. But I think what underpins it is this desire and this trust to see the best in people and to enjoy other people's success. And I suppose the thing I like to talk about that sort of illustrates that the best is when I was sort of somewhere in the middle of my army career, I used to do quite a lot of offshore sailing, and I was invited when I was in Germany to go on a short 1-week sailing, and I was the only commissioned officer on the boat, which doesn't make any difference to the sailing of the boat, but the individuals on there wanted to create a sailing association, and they had this idea that it would be quite difficult to do in the way they wanted to do it because sailing had been very much a sort of commissioned officer's sport. And I said, well, yeah, I'm very supportive of doing that, but actually the way the army works, you're going to need a commissioned officer to just open a few doors for you. So I did that role for them. So, some pretty junior people who set up this excellent sailing organisation that ran for years and years and years. And I was very pleased to do that. And I think that the thing I've really enjoyed with sailing is you take people who've never sailed before and teach them to sail, which is lovely. But on about day 3, I used to like to sit below deck, and you can sort of feel from the way the boat moves whether it's going in the right place and the right things are happening or if something's about to go wrong. But as far as the people on deck are concerned, they're really sailing the boat and they're in charge. And that's so empowering for them. I used to really enjoy that. So it's really empowering for people.
Thanks, Fiona. That's, that reflects a lot of things that maybe Bobby and I have talked about in leadership. And also, really interestingly, reference to kindness reflects also the fact that we had another veteran on as a guest a while ago, the lovely Reverend Alison Riley. And again, one of her big key values was kindness. And I think it's really interesting that it's not really quite how people imagine military officers to be thinking about kindness. There's this stereotype of what military leadership is, and certainly this idea of service and kindness are not really, I suspect, the words that would come up from a civilian perspective. What do you think, Bobby?
I agree. I think just listening to Fiona as she starts with us today, the kindness was the piece that sort of like leapt out for me as well as, well, Fiona, you don't know much about me other than the ghastly stories that Bridget told you before I actually came on board, just putting that out there. But being a coach and hearing you very openly talk about something that happened in your childhood, but something that stays with you to make sure that that's not the same for other people, that something kind has been born out of something that wasn't very kind at all for you as well, along with servant leadership. And then the other piece that I love is in military terms, we often talk about heli view, whereas you've just almost talked about underview in the fact of being in the boat and letting other people take the lead as well. I think there's the key things there. And I think that's the thing that people don't realise as well from the military when we talk about servant leadership, is that we are always looking for people to be able to take responsibility for themselves in particular situations and to make decisions. It's not all about command and control. There are the environments where it has to be, but it's not all like that. And I think that that's the juxtaposition for us as leaders, that as a military leader, you get to do both. You get to be absolutely the people who are empowering others, as well as every now and again having to tell people what to do. But I think that people concentrate on one bit more than the other, if that makes sense.
Fiona, have you come across other stereotypes? So, I mean, you left the military and then you've moved into a number of different roles. You've set up your business, Ruralink. You've been a lecturer. You're a coach as well, I think, and a teacher or a lecturer. And I think I've seen you do mentoring, all kinds of elements with people. And I wondered, while we as military or veterans are very aware of the amazing skill sets and the transferable skills that the military have you come across this idea, this sort of stereotypical view of people in the military that actually sometimes can be a hurdle for people who are moving outside of the military into civilian life?
I have a little bit, and I think there are a few people that do exhibit some of the characteristics, service leavers who do exhibit the characteristics that a largely uninformed or out-of-date public might expect. But my experience is that if you can spend some time with people, as with most things, it's much more powerful to demonstrate or have someone experience something than tell them something. So we can tell people that your stereotype's out of date or we don't think it's quite right, and they'll go, yeah, whatever, maybe. But if you spend some time with them and they get to know you and think, well, actually, that's somebody I can work with or who might help me with this, that, the other, then that's much more powerful. I had, for people who are leaving the services, I worked with a young lady who was warfare officer in the Royal Navy, and she was looking for an opportunity to work with cattle. She got this idea she'd like to work with cattle, and it happened fortuitously for her to coincide with someone else contacting me and saying they had this large dairy farm in Scotland and they were really looking for a farm manager, and they've been trying for years. They've been trying to develop one of their own people. They'd been trying to recruit externally, from New Zealand, and they just hadn't been able to do it. And I said, well, look, I've got this young person, and farming's a very male industry and there are more women in it, but it's still quite unusual. And so that was another hurdle. But I said, look, she hasn't got any real experience, but could you just offer her a week's work experience on your farm? And they were desperate enough to say yes. And then, of course, on the other flip side, I spoke to this young lady and I said, look, I don't suppose for a minute that anything's going to come out of this, but you're going to get some great work experience. And on day 4, she was offered a job just because they got to know her and they could see the skills she had in organising things, the intelligent questions she was starting to ask, the way she was able to interact with the different people, in all different roles on the farm. They didn't offer the farm manager's job, and they invented a very poorly paid job for the first year. But she is now 3 years on, the farm manager, and loving it. And that's really an extraordinary story, and it comes from just creating that space for someone to be experienced as an individual. She'd have never got an interview there from her CV. There's absolutely no way an employer would have taken a risk on her. But give her the opportunity, create the space, and they've now got the farm manager they needed, and everybody's very happy.
I love that. And yet I am also sitting here, and I think that I'm hoping that this takes us somewhere into talking more about Ruralink, Fiona, because I am so interested in it. Because having been brought up in a farming community, when I left the military, it wasn't something that I ever hankered to go back into again. And yet I am really intrigued by people's stories that have come from the military who are looking for this space that you are providing for them. I mean, are you able to say a little bit about how it was born?
Yes, let me tell you another little story, I suppose. As a young officer, when I was commissioned out of Sandhurst in 95, my first posting was to an infantry battalion, which was quite normal for intelligence corps officers, which is what I was. And I went to Bosnia during the immediately post the United Nations phase. I went to Bosnia with an infantry battalion, and it was my first exposure to improvised explosive devices and mines being put on sides of roads and so forth. And as a result, one wasn't allowed to step anywhere that wasn't well-formed tarmac. When I came back from that tour, I have a very vivid memory of going to visit my parents and standing in their garden, barefoot, wiggling my toes in the grass. And that sort of visceral memory, that touches all parts of your body, the smell of the countryside and the greenness of England and so forth, was really powerful. And I think that memory came back to me when I was sort of reaching the decision that I was going to leave the armed forces. I was doing a coaching course. I was doing my coaching course as part of that process, really. And I was encouraged to look at a coaching exercise called Passion Expertise, which is in What Colour is Your Parachute, which is an American book that's very well known, which I've never bothered to purchase a copy of, I'm sorry to say. But the Passion Expertise model is absolutely excellent. And I had a huge Schrank, which is the German word for a wardrobe, large wardrobe with 4 quarters on the 2 doors. And for about 6 months, I had Post-its all over this Schrank. Basically working out what I was passionate about and what I was good at, what I was expert at. And when I worked through that, eventually I came out with 2 things that I was good and interested in working in. The first was human talent, and the second was something to do with the countryside. And at the time, I thought this was a real dilemma, because I was like, well, which of these 2 career paths am I going to go down? And of course, eventually I worked out that I could put the 2 together, and that's where Ruralink came from. There were some other things along the way, but initially that's what I was looking at. It was about the time the new apprenticeship was coming in. So I was looking at apprenticeships and how we could apply that. I created the veteranship because I didn't think people coming out of the forces would want to be on an apprenticeship because it has a certain cachet about it. And so that's where Ruralink came from, with a few more steps along the way. And then, unfortunately, I was just sort of getting that steady. I was starting to be dependent on it. My other income had fallen away. I was focused on Ruralink. And then, of course, we came into the pandemic period, which caused me some significant financial strain. And so that's how I then got into university teaching, which provided an income. And then at the same time, or as we came out of the pandemic, I was offered some contract work. And that's where Ruralink split into 2 different things. Ruralink Veteran, which is looking at working. We do a lot of coaching of individuals, but I'm more interested in the systemic side of it, of working with employers and education providers to make their offerings more accessible to service leavers, which involves a little bit of risk. And then we also do rural training, which is more aimed at the industry. and we've developed and we now run with partners some courses. Yeah, so there's a bit of me as an individual, and then obviously there's identifying a need and finding a model that fits that need. And that relationship between employer, training or education provider, and there is a difference, and a service leaver or another person changing careers who's putting those three together, I think requires a catalyst, and that's what we've tried to do. The problem, of course, in the countryside and most rural industries is that there's very little money in it. And again, from a business point of view, that's really difficult because nobody's got spare margin to pay for the catalyst, which is a person. So the example I gave you about my Royal Navy dairy farm manager, there was a fee involved in that, but that's difficult to come by, and that was a very large employer who had tried everything else, and therefore was prepared to pay. And when I go and talk at industry events, at agricultural shows, my talks are always very well received, but then the follow-ups I get are, oh, we need someone to help in our on-farm cheese production system for 6 weeks in the summer. No, that's not what I do. And when you say, well, look, I'll come and work with you and help you find someone who can run your farm for you, or so you can focus on your off-farm diversification, there really very rarely is the mindset to be able to do that. There's not enough thinking space, because a lot of farmers, particularly, and even estate managers are very, very pressed for time and money.
I'm really interested in that, because whilst not farming, I was also really keen, when I was working in hospitality, to talk to people about those leaving the service who would make the most amazing operations managers, general managers for hotels. And we got as far as, oh, well, they might be quite good in maintenance if they've got the right trade, etc., etc. But trying to get them to understand the leap of these people who were able to team build, work with that very wide range of human beings, both people working there and customers, etc., because they were so adamant they had to have hospitality experience. And I think that, listening to your story, there is an element of that as well. And I think that there are a lot of industries out there that, and not just from the transitioning military personnel into there, but this whole business about somebody needing to having had the experience to do X. Now, I get it. If you're a doctor or a lawyer, barrister, or whatever it might be, but there are so many career opportunities out there where I'm getting on a soapbox now, but I just wish that people would have the nous, a bit like the story that you told, to take somebody on and try them out, when they've got a willingness to it. So I wonder, in saying all of that, this triangle that you're creating between the service leader, the training and the employer, how you're navigating that.
So the truth is, I'm not doing it particularly well, but there are a lot of organisations that are. And in the UK, the veteran space is dominated by military-related charities, which isn't news to anyone. But a lot of those charities are doing exactly that, because what they're doing is they're breaking down the risk to an employer. And the way they're doing that is by creating opportunities for people to get experience, because it's quite understandable that an employer looks at two, personalities, characters, people for a role. One of them's got 5 to 10 years experience in their industry sector, whatever it is, and the other one has got military experience. And it's not surprising that the military person gets an interview, impresses them. On the day, they absolutely love that individual. But in the cold light of the board that's considering it the following morning, they go, well, it's a bit of a risk, though, isn't it? So let's go with the person who's got 10 years of technical experience. It's not a surprise. So in terms of supporting service people into those roles where they will then excel, 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, then the way that most organisations that support them is providing ways to de-risk them to an employer by providing opportunities for work experience or training, so that when you then look at a CV, it does say 10 years of military experience, but it also says, and they've done this course and they've done these 2 work placements with companies that are recognised. And that way, when they then impress in interview or in a work experience, they're taking the risk away from the employer. And it's a really good model, and it's done very well across a number of different sectors now.
I like the way that you've described it, though, in terms of de-risking. I found an article in Forbes which talked about career pivoting strategies, and one of the elements was this ensuring that people had, I guess it's this idea of continuing education, always wanting to learn, and that, the military does it to an extent in the terms of resettlement and providing education opportunities, and really being able to, as a leader, to support people who are likely to go into transition, or just who are looking to improve their career prospects, whether it's from the military or elsewhere. Being able to assist in identifying training or education that actually is going to be useful to going towards a career pivot. So, for example, when I was preparing to join the UN, I looked at doing some project management training. And while I've never, ever used the course that I did, it being on the CV absolutely made a difference. And so I think that in terms of, as leaders supporting people into pivoting, and that can be if you're managing change and that there will be people who are going to be made redundant, and supporting them towards that and making successful career transitions after redundancy, whether that's supporting people in the military who are going to be leaving or moving towards resettlement. But all of those ideas, and for you yourself, I mean, you did some coaching, you trained as a coach, all of those things that have, whether they are not the primary element of what you do now, but they have actually enabled you to get to that point and given you some gravitas, or given you the ability for people externally looking in at you to go, oh, well, they've done that. And I think it's also really important, I guess, in terms of how we write our CVs. I've talked to a lot of people, not just in the military, but when I've been in the UN, talking to people about how they can progress their careers, and looking at their CV and how they describe the work that they do and the experience that they have, and describing it in terms that actually means something to the industry that they are trying to get into, I think is also really important, because there's a difference. And I've noticed a lot of military people do it a lot better than we did when I left the military. Just sort of said I was a troop commander, blah, blah, blah. And now actually people are describing themselves in terms of operational roles, chief of operations, CEO, CFO, or talking about their project management skills and all of those things, so that it actually gives those people who are being asked to take a risk, the business that's being asked to take you on, gives you a much easier task of explaining to the board why you think this person is less of a risk than maybe they would be if they just said, oh, I did 20 years in the military.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. There's being able to speak that language, which is about understanding the culture of the industry or sector you want to go into. And there's also the role of the CV at different stages in a career transition or a job application. So if you look at culture, for instance, I now, as I said, I do a lot of my work in the education space, both as a university lecturer, and I've also for a few months now been chair at a sixth form college. Now those are slightly different further in higher education, and clearly those roles are very different. But the culture in education is very different from the culture in the military, and it's also very different from the culture in agriculture and the rural sector. And, my military self would not have lasted 5 seconds in either of those areas, because I'm so direct. In education, if you don't start an email with "Dear so-and-so, I hope you're well," you're considered brusque. Now, whereas I think that's just a waste of time. It's very civilized, but what a waste of time. But, if you don't do that, people get to know me and respect me for other things. And occasionally when I forget to be, and I write emails now. I write the email, and then I don't send it. Then I go back and top and tail it, because you've got to do that. It's just a different way of doing business. I go to meetings at the university, 2-hour meetings, of which I know that I'm only be required for about 5 minutes of it. And I've suggested that we set different times in the agenda so that those of us who are only involved for different 5 minutes can just attend for those 5 minutes. It went down like a lead balloon. It's just a different culture. But my point is, Bridget, the point about this different cultures is the experience you get is about de-risking you to an employer primarily, but also you can operate using the right language and the right culture in an interview or in a work experience, that you could turn up wearing the right clothes and all those sort of non-verbal communication essentials, which I think makes a huge difference. If I look like I belong, I'm more likely to get the role than if I look like an outsider trying to break in.
It's interesting you say that. I just saw a TikTok, because I'm a social media harlot, but I saw a TikTok thing this morning about a young Gen Z, I think, complaining about the fact she turned up to a job interview in a pair of shorts, and the HR person had suggested to her that they rescheduled the interview, and that she went back and changed, and she lost her mind, and she took it as an insult rather than that this person was actually trying to help her. And she just didn't get that what she was wearing was inappropriate, because that was the sort of thing that she wore all the time. So I just clicked a little button in my head, and I think you might have just set Bobby off on meetings, because it's a massive.
I am not going to do the whole meeting spiel. I unless you want me to. No, I won't do that. But I am so in agreement, not surprisingly, given my sort of like lifespan of work around culture and language, because I refer to myself as a bit of a translator, and I think that is the thing. I know we're talking about veterans and their transitions, but just in general, that there are these qualities that we have, there are these skills that we have, and they probably will work in, I don't know, let's say 60-70% of any type of industry. And a lot of it is about learning the walk, the talk, the acronyms, whatever it might be for the thing that you're actually in. And whilst it's not something that I sort of like plug with family members and then, a wider network of friends to help them with CVs when they're leaving the military, because I've been out for that much longer, is to say to them, no, don't call it this, call it that. Talk about this, talk about that, so that you can help. And I'm sure you're doing the same, Fiona, where you actually can get people to re-articulate things that they do, but make sense. To be honest,
I don't spend much time on CVs at all.
Oh, okay.
Because I think that networking and getting people in front of people is much more important.
Yeah.
The role of the CV, if you're sending a generic CV to 100 people, which a lot of service leavers try, and then they go, oh, nobody wants me because I've sent 100 CVs and I haven't had any replies. And then, of course, there's a vicious circle in that. It's very depressing. But if you, of course, look at tailoring that CV, then that's a skill, and that has a much more likely success. But yeah. I do think that putting people in a situation where they can talk to people, get recommended, then the whole aspect of networking is much more important. And I think service people and anybody else, but service people are getting much, much better at it. And the CV then is merely the evidence that the recommender in your network needs to put in front of someone, and they are looking for it to endorse their current opinion. They're not making a judgment based on it, and it's not nearly as important as if you're sending it as the initial point of contact.
No, for sure.
Can I just share something relating to Bridge, you were just talking about a person who went to an interview dressed in shorts. And I read something the other day that was fantastic, which I think is advice for every generation. For professional work, I don't want to be able to see up it, see down it, or see through it. Anything else will go.
I love that. And actually, yeah, well, we're gonna move on after Bobby's got some questions, but one of the topics I think we are going to touch on is this idea of age groups, different age groups, and how they navigate maybe differently.
You've just given me the segue, although I would like to say, having to write, being in organisations where they say, can you write a dress code? I'm like, for God's sake, because that'd be another soapbox moment and me having to write policies. But I said, if you're not going to a nightclub, if you're not going to the gym, I can't remember, there was a third, or you're not going on holiday, don't wear it. Because, that sort of like gets rid of shorts, flip-flops, boob tubes, short skirts. But I think that Fiona's encapsulates it much quicker, so that's good. Anyway, the segue was about different age groups. Now, the question I had was, when we're talking about veterans pivoting and using their experience, that they can move into different roles in different industries. And, and as Fiona was just sort of like saying there about the networking and putting people in front of people, et cetera, et cetera. And it left me thinking about, and I don't know if this is where you touch into now in terms of lecturing and being involved in the sixth form college, et cetera, Fiona, because there are then those of the younger generation who don't have the backdrop of the experience. They might not have had all of the training. So it's how they are standing out to put themselves in the right place in order to get the first role. And just a little addition to that, which I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts on as well, as I was reading something somewhere recently where there are those organisations and recruitment agencies, etc., who are worried by how quickly the younger generation seems to move through their jobs. And, the demographics are saying that they're not staying for much longer than 2 years, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, they are moving, in my view, to get more experience. If the organisation can't find that progression through it for them, they will move and find it for themselves. So that in actual fact, when you see a CV in exactly the same way that you're talking about with a veteran having done a course, done a work placement, et cetera, my view would be is that that's similar for somebody younger, that they've moved to get another piece of knowledge, they've moved to get another piece of experience, they've done a course, so that you can see, and again, I know that we're not going back to the CV and it's about getting people in front of them, but if you are at your starting mark, what are the things that are making you stand out? And that's some of the things that, having been in HR for a long, long time, that I would be looking at to see people setting themselves apart, that they've actually done some stuff to get themselves better equipped. And I'm just wondering, in terms of this other part of your life that you're working in, your thoughts.
So, of course, people need to differentiate themselves. But I would say that if you're looking to start your first career versus your second or follow-on career, the difference, of course, is not just in experience, but it's knowledge, skills and experience, that tired acronym of KSE, or KSB if you want to switch behaviours for experience. And the young people who are looking to start their first career, whether they're going down a graduate route, going an apprenticeship route, or whatever it is, I think Barack Obama's quote is one of the best ones. Be the person who gets things done. And so young people who look the same on paper, who've got very similar experience. Again, I'm not a great fan of these personal statements that people are encouraged to write to get into educational establishments. And I think, to be honest, for UCAS, for universities, they're about to go out anyway. It doesn't matter really what your first job is. In my generation, it was newspaper rounds. Now it's retail or hospitality, that the cliche first job. But if you get a reputation in that job for being the person who gets things done, then you'll either get promoted within the individual. When I was doing interviewing when I was interviewing 16 to 19-year-olds as part of the officer selection for the army, I quickly became aware that people who'd been in retail, those sort of roles, if the individual had been the key holder, then that was a real indicator. If you, as a young person, are allowed to open up and lock down, or you'd been the person who was allowed to take the money to the bank, that's a key indicator of someone who's trusted and responsible. You can ask them in interviews, ask them all sorts of things about responsibility taken, but that's the thing. That would be the thing. 2 identical CVs, one says they've been the key holder. That's going to be the person you want. And yeah, Barack Obama's be the person who gets it done. Whether they then get promoted in their company or not, I totally agree with you, Bobby, that young people are being masters of their own careers and are building their own experience. Great. That means they come earlier to being the sort of person that is in maybe a career change or even advancing career, and they understand their own value and they understand their own values. And that's where people who are career changing should be. They understand themselves. And I think young people, Gen Z, understand themselves or try to understand themselves much earlier than perhaps older generations have done. That makes them more mobile.
I love that. That's really great. Thank you.
Fiona, have you noticed a change in your leadership style since you left the military, other than having to take more care in writing emails? And I hear your pain on that one.
I think I have become a much more conscious collaborator. And what I mean by that is that I think I'm a relatively natural delegator. I'm quite confident with that. I'm happy empowering people, always have been. And I think I've been happy enabling people. But I'm not now about a sort of power vector where I'm creating a situation for someone else. I'm much of a collaborator now than I used to be. And as I say, I sort of use the term about conscious collaboration. And conscious collaboration is much more a sort of equal thing rather than I'm the leader in this relationship, you're the follower, or I'm the follower in this relationship and I know who the leader is. It's much more about what can I give to the situation? What do I need help because that doesn't fit with my strengths? I have something, when people talk about strengths and weaknesses or strengths and areas for development, I think when you're young, you should work on your areas for development. But I think when you're a bit older, I think you should work on improving your strengths. And I think I know what my strengths are now. And I look to collaborate with people who have strengths in the areas that I don't. And that seems to be a very successful way to work. I don't think that's how I was when I was younger or when I was in the armed forces, partly because of the structure. But the other thing I'd say is that in the armed forces, I think there is a bit of a difference between the approach of those who work in more technical areas, perhaps it's because the soldiers, sailors, aviators are more educated, or because it's not possible for a leader to understand the nuances of their particular role. And so people who've worked in leadership roles in very technical areas have to trust and work with their people. They can't sort of heroically lead them into battle because it's not that sort of relationship. And so I think some leaders in less technical areas don't operate in that way and actually don't understand that type of leadership. It's a different approach. And I think a lot of people who've worked in more technical areas therefore find it easier to find their role in new professions than perhaps those who, not because of lack of education, but just because of again, it's a cultural issue for those people, I think. I can tell you about the 3 Ps if you like. So the 3 Ps stands for place, profession and position. And service leavers tend to be changing all 3 at the same time. Place being geographical place where you're going to live and work. They may be the same, they may be different. Profession, armed forces, military, clearly expecting to change that. And position being that grade or rank, the level in the organisation. And a lot of people find themselves coming to the end of a military career and they change place, profession and position all at the same time. And I was developing this theory, and someone else pointed out to me that the problem with this is it's the amount of risk you put. Again, it's about risk. So if you can find where you're going to live and therefore look to work in that area, 2 years before you leave the services, for example, then you've taken that level out, you've done that difficult transition, that's place, tick. If you're looking to change your profession, i.e. you're certain you don't want to work in defence anymore, well, if you're in some technical space, perhaps you identify yourself as whatever that technical skill was, and therefore that's your profession, and not military. If military really is what defines you, then perhaps stay in that space for the first civilian role. If you want to go into consulting on sustainable issues, but perhaps do consulting in the military space for a year or so to learn how to do consulting. And that's the same with the position. So whether it's consulting or whether you want to run your own plumbing business or whatever it is, you're going to change your position, but try not to do it all at the same time. And it's really brilliant. And if you can look at the 3 Ps and separate them out, and therefore take a staged approach, I think a career change takes about 5 years. A moving scale, you can put 2-3 years before you change your career, or you can put 2 days before you end one role, and that means it takes longer afterwards. And within that 5 years, you might change job 2 or 3 times. But I think about 5 years after you've really started focusing on it is where you can look back and say, yeah, I am now a this, I'm no longer a that.
Can you remember some of the key pieces in a 5 years for you with the transition that you were taking, where there was like a shift or a jolt where you go, oh God, right, now I'm not going to do that anymore, I'm going to do this instead, or anything like that? I mean, are there markers that you, I mean, everyone's journey is different, I understand that, but I'm just interested if you can think of anything from your own.
So I think I was a very ambitious army officer. I was a pretty successful army officer. And then I had some advice when I was commanding my battalion from a friend who's still a very good friend, a couple of years older than me. She'd also been a battalion commander, and she said, you need to really take a real break at the end of your command tour. And she really meant, go off grid for a month or so. But I took it a step further and managed to get myself posted to an exchange posting with an American headquarters in Germany. And it meant I wasn't in the UK bubble anymore. And for the first time in a very long time, I had hobbies and time and space. And I sort of discovered a side of me that had been dormant or underdeveloped for a while because I've been so focused on my career. I was very happy with it, but it was different. I started acting again and singing and sort of things that had interested me when I was younger. So the idea came upon me that when I went back to the UK, I could see the role I would probably go to. I was likely to be promoted, and I could see that I would be working very long days. And I began to realise that I didn't want to do that. And so I know where the decision to leave the forces, which was a surprise to me, I know where that came. I then put myself through deliberate exercises, my passion, expertise, analysis over 6 months whilst I was in Germany was fundamental. And so it was a very deliberate decision to then do what I then did. And as I've said to you, I was knocked onto a slightly different course by the pandemic, but then weren't we all? So I think that what that means is that I gave my notice to the armed forces, which is a year's notice, whilst I was on that tour in Germany, and timed it in such a way that I wouldn't have to then serve a subsequent tour. And before I went to Germany for that tour, I had no inkling that I was going to leave. So it was very deliberate. So that means that for me, there was about 18 months of my transition before the date I stopped being paid. I did a master's degree as part of the process, and that led me to my first civilian job, which was a chief operating officer role, which talks about those transferable skills. It wasn't a great fit, it lasted just under a year, but of course it was invaluable experience, and it's great on my CV. So sure. That brings all those things together. But that wasn't right. So that's another year. So 2.5 years later, I then really focused on Ruralink, and we are where we are now.
Cracking. Thank you.
Fiona, one of the things that we often ask guests is, and rather than the sort of traditional question, which is what message would you give to a young you? It's much more of a, what message do you think you could learn from a young you? What do you think a young you could teach you that would be helpful now?
So I was really glad you gave me advance notice of this question, because I found it really, really difficult. And I'm not going to answer it directly, but I will give you a couple of observations about it. So I have been thinking about it for 2 days, almost to the exclusion of everything else. And to be honest, my young self was so busy with sports and music that I wouldn't have had time to think of advice for anyone else. But the other thing is a generational thing. My young self was very respectful of older people and would not have presumed to give someone of my advanced current age any advice at all. But young people now would.
Yeah.
And they'd have something valuable to say. So I take advice and I seek advice from people in their teens and their 20s. And I actually really enjoy conversations with 7 and 8 year olds who obviously, often if you give them space, have some really wise things to tell you. So it might have been nice to speak to myself now when I'm younger and listen to myself, but I don't think I'd have had very much I'd have offered, to be honest.
Do you have anything then that you've learned, a really cool piece of advice that you've had from someone younger, from in their 20s, that you would like to share?
Or from a 7, 8 year old?
Yeah.
I think it's around the way they see the world. We started off by talking about kindness, and I think that's one of the things that's refreshing, talking to very young children who haven't been damaged by experience. I like it when children ask you to please pay attention to them, not your whatever device you're fiddling with. But then again, my niece gives me technical advice on how to use various social media platforms, so that's quite useful. I have got no great gem of wisdom, I'm afraid, to offer from a young person. I enjoy their company, but no, I haven't been able to identify anything gleaming I can offer you, I'm afraid.
I love the kindness point, though, and we're back to kindness. And I think that, again, Alison Riley said a very similar thing to you, that what she's struck by in her engagement with young people, the importance that they attribute to kindness, that maybe as we get older and maybe more cynical, we've forgotten about how important being kind is. And so maybe that is the message. I think that certainly a number of people I've spoken to recently have sort of really, really highlighted that maybe we can learn from the younger generation to remember how important kindness is in just being good human beings and getting along. We're coming towards the end of this, and thank you so much, Fiona. It's been so interesting, and really much as you may not have been able to give us a nugget from your younger self, I think your older self is giving plenty of really useful nuggets. Bobby.
So my question is that since we did the guest gifts recently, this is all about putting little ripples out into the world, getting more people to come and listen to us. And can I just first off thank you for all of the nuggets that you've given us today, Fiona. It's been cracking. Thank you very much indeed. 3 people that you would consider might fancy listening in to More Than a Lumpy Jumper, first and foremost because you are now a recorded guest on it, but with some of the other things that we've actually done episodes on, who would you like to name?
So yeah, thank you. So 3 different people from 3 different areas of my current life have come to mind. The first is Becky Grove, who is a wonderful, I was going to say young, but I don't know how young she is. She's younger than me. A wonderful woman who works very creatively in the sustainable industries. She's a consultant. Her background is in filmmaking, and she's just this wonderful enabler. She started with a professional partner an organisation called the Emergent Generation, which is empowering and bringing together young people who are interested in sustainable industries. Wonderful, wonderful person. That's Becky. The second person I think would really enjoy it would be a chap called Mike Kroll, who's one of my colleagues at the university. And what made me think of him is that he gave the most excellent conference speech I've ever heard to the Security Institute in 2023. And it was about crisis communications. And the way he did it is he listed 4 generations, and then he got a panel, one of us each from 4 different generations. And his talk was nothing about communications at all. It was about the different experiences we have grown up with, right from the underpants that men wear in different generations through to, phone boxes to mobile phones, the Nokias and so forth. It was brilliant. But then, of course, the audience asked questions, and each of us in our different generational blocks gave very different answers. It's really, really powerful. So Mike Kroll, fantastic communicator, and understands the difference between the generations, and he understands the security business, which is why he's teaching. And then a wonderful lady called Joyce Black, who mentored me. So I came to be chair of Cirencester College, unfortunately, following 2 deaths. And so I got bounced into it. And so one of the first things I did was ask for advice all over the place, away from the college. But and I was lucky enough to have Joyce as my mentor for the first 6 months of my chairship. And she was so insightful and so valuable. And so I recently took her out to dinner, obviously, to thank her very much. And she told me some really tragic things that happened in her life. And I just think that sort of vulnerability and then that ability to channel things to then offer yourself in the service of others is so powerful. And Joyce totally did that to me. So they're my 3 shout outs, and all of them would enjoy your podcast as I do hugely. And who knows, may give you something back too.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Bridge?
Yeah, no, that's it. Thank you so much, Fiona. Sorry that we gave you so much traumatic homework for the last 2 days, but I loved the response. It was really, really great. And thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time. It's been lovely to catch up after such a long time.
Come and stay, Bridge. That would be great.
I'll try not to leave before you wake up next time.
Fantastic what you're doing with this podcast. I really enjoy it. And hopefully it's making an impact. I think it deserves to.
Oh, thank you. Lovely to talk to you.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
See you in 15 years.
Thanks for listening. All the resources are on northernalumpyjumper.com and on the More Than a Lumpy Jumper Spotify page. Next week, we're talking all things criticism. Bobby and Bridge will chat about how their capacity to deal with criticism has evolved, or not, over the years. And they'll share coping strategies that don't involve yelling, "Fuck off!" at members of the public, or settling into a teenage drop. So come and join us for being critical of criticism.